Okay, today we are continuing to talk about Truman, and we are going to get more into the events of his presidency. Now, I am going to do this in two parts because today we're mainly going to talk about the end of the war. So, how is it ending, and what are some effects or results of what has been going on? So, there are several different things that are kind of connected, not really. And I want to talk a lot about those as we get into his presidency. And then I do want to come back and talk more about the social aspect and some of the things, how America is changing and what it looks like. Because this is really, you still have, when you go looking at houses, you can still see houses from 19 40s and 1950s. It's not uncommon, and so we're getting more into a time that people would remember and that you could identify with. So first we've got Harry Truman's picture here. We have his card that he VP won, so he was the vice president once. He's president 33, and here is his years. One kind of interesting fact, he is Harry S. Truman. And guess what? The S doesn't stand for anything. Most of the times when you have a letter like that, it's an abbreviation of a name. And his S doesn't stand for anything. His parents couldn't decide whether to name him after which grandparent. And so instead of, and it both started with S, instead of picking one, they just put the S there to represent both. So I thought that was interesting that the S doesn't stand for a specific name. It's just an S. And then here is his campaign poster. So beat high prices, and it's Harry Truman and his vice president. Doesn't really seem like it's got much of a catchy slogan or anything that we see a lot of the other ones having, but I think it kind of speaks to who he is. It just kind of came out and said what he wanted to say. Plain speaking, not really going with any gimmick, just telling you the way it is. And I think that's a lot of ways the way Truman was. Okay, so just a few weeks in his vice presidency, Harry Truman is there. He gets a call to come to the White House. He goes to the White House. Sees Eleanor Roosevelt. She meets with him and tells him, Harry, the president, has died. And he immediately thinks of her and says, is there anything that we can do for you? And she turns it around and says, no. Is there anything we can do for you? Because you're the one in trouble now. So basically, you're the president now. You're the one with all the troubles, not me. So, I thought that exchange was a little interesting. So anyway, he's thrust is the word, just thrown into the presidency, not really expecting it. It's the end of the war, but the war has not ended yet. Germany surrenders on May 7th. But remember, they are not the only Axis powers, and Japan is holding out and they are not giving up. Germany surrenders their part, but Japan continues. And it doesn't seem like they are going to back down anytime soon. So they try negotiations and it doesn't work. Truman gives basically a warning that if you don't stop, you will be destroyed. And they didn't know anything. There was a project going on under Roosevelt called the Manhattan Project that was working on an atomic bomb. Now, this is different than the bombs that just dropped from the planes. This is one that's actually using chemicals that would spread and would kill thousands of people in all directions. It wouldn't target just one simple little army base or something. It would be much more damaging and could be damaging to your exposure to it. So people not only died immediately, but they would die in the future from their exposure to the radiation from these bombs. So we had been working on this for a little bit, but Truman, as vice president, knew nothing about it. FDR didn't tell him. And FDR didn't tell Truman a lot. Truman came in and basically had to learn everything. And so he was immediately told about the Manhattan Project and the power that we had. They tested it, I believe, in July in New Mexico, and it works. The man, Oppenheimer, was one of the men that was one of the scientists working behind coming up with the bomb. And it was reported that as he watched the bomb go off, he said a quote that said, "I have become death, destroyer of worlds." And it was staggering. It was stopping it because they just saw the destruction that this could create. And then it's that idea in the book that I read to you in the morning message. What happens if more than one person has this? So then what's it going to look like next? It's not, things don't look the same anymore. They look completely different. So he gives kind of a warning. They don't take it seriously. They didn't know about the bomb. And so he gives the command for the first bomb to be dropped on Hiroshima in Japan on August 6, 1945. Many people criticize the decision of using an atomic bomb. This picture down here is the cloud that this bomb creates. Okay, it just instantly sets things on fire and just destroys it. And so you're bombing a town. You're not bombing an army base. You're bombing a village, villages. So this is people. This is children. This is women. This is men. This is grandparents. This is everybody. Okay? So many people have criticized, did criticize, will criticize the idea of using something so destructive. But Truman's idea behind it was that he was saving hundreds of thousands of soldiers' lives that would be lost if he sent an invasion into Japan. If he sent the army into Japan, it was causing all of those hundreds of lives. And I think I've said this before. It goes back to the choice that, yes, all lives are important. Every single life is a gift from God. It doesn't matter where you're from or where you live. However, as president, it's your job to protect whom? As president of a country, your job is to protect your people. So they have an interesting dilemma that the rest of us never have to make. What am I willing to do? Not because I hate the Japanese, not because I think they deserve it. That's not what it is. What am I willing to do to preserve our human life that I have sworn in and declared that I am under honor to protect and serve? So you have a decision to make because you are the president of one country and it is your job to look out for that country. Now, does that mean now you have to be really careful because that power has led people to treat other people however they want, and that's like Hitler. It wasn't that you're better than anyone. It's not that you have to destroy anyone that is not like you. But what is it that you need to do if you are to protect your people? Like I said, tricky question. Glad I don't have to make it. But this is why remember I told you the quote on his desk was "the buck stops here." He realized that it was his decision. After this happened, he had someone come in his office that was partly responsible for this. And I think it might have been the pilot who dropped the bomb and was like upset and we shouldn't have done this and kind of backtracking and really upset about what they had done. And Truman basically said to get this man out of my office because once you make a decision, he knew that he could not change things. And so he had to make a decision and stick with it and move forward and not keep going back and wringing your hands over what you had done because you did make the decision and now you have to move forward with your decision and live with it. So they still, even after the first bomb, and we're talking hundreds of thousands, we're talking over, 100,000 people killed in the first bomb. and ones that were injured and not killed yet, they still were refusing to surrender. So he orders a second one dropped on another town. Oh, I didn't write it down. Nagasaki was the second one on August 9th. And between the two bombs, I couldn't find a specific number, but around about 200,000 people were probably killed by those two bombs. And some were immediately and some were later over damage that had been done from the dropping of the bomb. And then on the 9th, or on the 10th, Japan finally surrenders. And the war is over. So we had, when Germany surrenders, that was VE Day, victory in Europe. And then we had VJ Day, which is victory in Japan, when they surrendered. So there were two different victories that we celebrated. Then after the war, okay, so between the United States, Britain, France, and the Soviet Union split Germany up because Germany is a loser, right? So they don't get to go back and get all of their power back and work up their armies and all. They don't even get their country. Germany is split into 4 zones. U.S. gets part, Britain gets part, France, and Soviet Union. Eventually, the United States, Britain, and France's part all becomes one. And then Soviet Union keeps their part, and it becomes East and West Germany. Okay, and Berlin is actually the capital, and it's actually split in half. And Soviet Union is communist. Now we're going to get into some explanation of this. Winston Churchill, who was the leader in Britain, gets up and says, when all of this is happening right at the end of the war, an iron curtain is descending over Europe. And that iron curtain was representing communism. And the Soviet Union, Stalin, was communist. And a communist, a lot of times, is called a communist dictatorship. And what a communist means, how it's different than us. We are a democracy, which means that the people decide who is in leadership. We get to vote and decide who our president is. Not only do we decide who our president is, we vote for who's going to represent us in making our laws, and that is Congress. So the people in a democracy have a lot of say. Because that's why you need to be responsible with your vote, right? Because we are picking the people who will speak for us. And so that's what a democracy is. Communism is that you have basically a dictator that is in charge, and then everything is controlled by the government. Okay, so in our democracy, we also have what's called a capitalistic society, which means that you have the ability to earn money, and that money that you earn, you get to keep. Now, we have taxes because the government is in charge of making sure that we have schools and roads and a military that protects us. So we give some part of our income back to the government. Okay, but you get to say what job you work at. You get to say how much education you're going to have. You get to say how much money, like what kind of job you're going to have so that you make a certain amount of money. And then when you earn that money, you get to decide what to do with it. If you want to buy a house or you want to buy a car or whatever you want to do, that's up to you. We have a lot of control over our jobs and our money. A communist government says, okay, lots of communist run countries have everyone in school, okay, and elementary, and they're watching you through elementary school and high school to see what your abilities are. And then they will tell you which jobs that you are allowed to go on to, and they will tell you whether you can go to college or not. So if they don't think you're smart enough, you don't get to go to college. You have to work in this shop on this corner. Okay, and all the money is spread among all the people. So you don't get to decide what you want to do with your money. It's taken and spread out more evenly. So if you have a communist country, you don't have the very rich and the middle rich, and you don't have all these levels of society that we have, because everyone is responsible for working for themselves and earning their own money in our country. So you have people who can earn a lot of money, you have people that earn kind of middle-ish money, and you have people who maybe don't earn a lot of money. But that's the way they are. So they don't, if they haven't worked or they don't have the education that others have, then they may not have as much money. In a communist government, is spread pretty much evenly, so that you don't have all of that, but you also don't have the ability to work for it. So think about your work ethic then. Do you think you would work harder or not as hard? Probably not as hard, right? If that's what I'm going to do for the rest of my life and there's no ability to ever change it. There's a sadness there because you don't have a control. You're being told what to do. So that is the way Stalin was running the Soviet Union, and that's the way he wanted to run his part of Germany also. So then what happens is the Cold War begins. Cold War meaning hot, meaning intense, okay? So you're shooting at each other, you've got the tanks, what we just came out of. Cold War is not that I am shooting at you, but we don't agree. We're not going to probably trade with each other. We're not going to be very friendly. We're going to be suspicious of each other all the time. And we are supporting opposite sides, other countries. So we're not going to fight, but we might fight through other countries, almost like a board game. And I'm going to explain one example of that in just a minute. So, Soviet Union now knows that we have the atomic bomb. Then they test their bomb in 1949. So what happens? Now it's just like the book I read to you in the morning message. It becomes a balance of terror. Americans are terrified. What is going to happen if they want to take over and they want America to be communist? And we were afraid of this idea of communists. Communists became the enemy. And we were afraid of having a bomb dropped on us. My mom will remember having drills like this in school, air raid drills, where they stopped, they had a big alarm, and everyone got under their desks and put their hands over their head because they were practicing for the idea of what if we were bombed. Also, lots of houses had these little shelters in their backyard where they would put some canned food in. They had a little bed. They had a place to go in case all of a sudden we knew that we were being attacked. So there was a fear in the late 40s and early 50s of Russia. Well, it's called Soviet Union. There was a fear of Soviet Union. There was a fear of communist. There was a fear of the bomb. And even though life was kind of returning back to normal and mothers were coming back from the factories, and a lot of them were content to go back home and take care of their families, lots of babies were being born, the dads were back home, life was kind of returning to normal. There was a fear that kind of descended over things because of this kind of silent aggression with the Soviet Union. Truman, in 1947, declares his Truman Doctrine, which says that we have a desire to contain communism. We're not going to attack you, okay? If you want to be communist, you be communist. But we are not going to let it spread. And we will not sit around and watch you take over other countries slowly and let them become communist or make them communist. We are going to do what we can to support people fighting against you. So that's where it becomes a Cold War, because now Soviet Union knows we're not just going to sit back and let them take over whoever they want to take over, because eventually they would take over and then they would come and try to take over us, right? And they would have the power because they've taken over this nation and this nation and this nation. And there were so many nations weakened by World War II that they could have just come in and bowled them right over. So there were some uprisings in Turkey and Greece that were rebels, that communist rebels that were trying to take over those countries. So when he declares this Truman Doctrine, he sends $4 million of the United States money to help these two countries fight against communism. And a lot of our help will be in the form of money to other countries that are fighting against communism. Okay, so the Communist Red Army takes over China. At this time, that's all we know right now is that China is communist, but it wasn't then. China was not communist, and they take over during this time, and China is still communist society. That's why there's so many those teenagers and kids work so hard to prove themselves in school because they know it will determine what they do for the rest of their lives, because the government will tell you what you will do and who will go to college. Still now. Communist North Korea. So North Korea, we've heard a lot about them recently too. They've come back into the news. North Korea is still communist. They have a leader, a dictator. During this time, in June of 1950, North Korea invades South Korea and is trying to take them over and make them become communist, because South Korea is not communist. So this is an act of aggression that we are going to get involved in. So Truman sends troops over. So here is us fighting. Soviet Union is going to support North Korea. So are we fighting Soviet Union? Not really. We are using pawns through South Korea and North Korea to fight this idea of communism. So Truman sends troops over, and they were making advances. They were making some pretty good advances and getting pretty far in and taking back over and pushing North Korea back. The general's name was General MacArthur. And then China gets involved. Communist China comes to join North Korea's side. And the U.S. is forced to retreat and kind of go back. And now we haven't made the gains that we thought we did. So we have to kind of back up and run away. Okay, so we could only reach a stalemate, which means stopped. No side could get any further. It was just stopped, and people were just dying. It was an awful war. Truman refused to take the war to China. MacArthur said, we need to move this and go into China. And Truman said no. MacArthur, as a general, griped against the president and publicly disagreed with him and said, I don't think this is right, and we need to do this, we need this. Truman fired him. And then there was no treaty that was signed. Negotiations for this war dragged on and dragged on and dragged on, and it doesn't end. When President Truman leaves office, they're still trying to figure out what to do with this Korean War. So Eisenhower comes in and inherits this war and to try to figure out what are we going to do about this. Okay, so we have to leave that there until we get to Eisenhower. Now, more effects of World War II. Here's a few more things that have happened because of World War II. The United Nations, which is kind of like the League of Nations that Wilson wanted after World War I. The United Nations is created to prevent wars, promote human rights, and aid economic development all around the world. Okay, 50 nations attend. The United Nations is still a thing now. Okay, 50 nations attended in 1945 and signed the beginning, and we were one of the first people to join this time and say this is an organization that's going to work together so that we can solve problems in other ways without going to war. This is too much. We've had two. NATO which we still have today, was created in 1949 to have an alliance of countries that was working to protect them against communist Soviet Union. So this is when we started seeing fears of Soviet Union, the NATO was an alliance. It stands for North Atlantic Treaty Organization that was together to kind of protect us against the Soviet Union. The Marshall Plan was presented by, I think it's can't remember who Marshall was. I'll tell you later. To help rebuild and support nations that were destroyed by war. Now, the United States was really one of the only countries that benefited. Now, we lost a lot of soldiers, but we benefited economically, which means financially, from the war. We were making supplies, sending it out, being paid for those. We benefited economically, and we weren't bombed except for Pearl Harbor. Those other countries, there were bombs being dropped on England all the time, and not just air bases and things like that. It was towns, and people actually had to be evacuated. There was a time during World War II where kids in England were sent from their homes into the countryside to try to protect them. So they put these little kids on trains and sent them away to live with someone else in the country. Then when the country started getting bombed too and was unsafe, they put the children on trains and boats and sent them over to the United States to be cared for by people who didn't know them, because they were trying to protect the children. And Germany was just, with their blitzkrieg, was just dropping these bombs on these England towns. And so now, after war, they don't magically pop back, right? All these shops have been destroyed, so there's no stores, there's no farms anymore, so they don't have the food that they used to have. They don't have houses, but they don't have the economy to build houses back again. They lost all their money in putting their money into war, and now they have nothing to show for it. So there's so many countries that are completely destroyed. France was destroyed by the occupation of the Nazis, and so they have nothing and no way to build it back again. So the Marshall Plan says that we're going to help rebuild and support nations destroyed by war. And how are we going to do that? Through money. Between 1948 and 1952, Congress authorizes about $12 billion to be sent to these countries to help them rebuild and give them a start to kind of build back. About half of the money was split between Britain, France, and West Germany, which was our part. So about half of the money was sent to those three places, and then it was spread out to other countries that were also damaged. So that kind of shows you what's going on afterwards, how we're responding to the war, what has been the effect. Now we're still not at rest, because now we have this threat of communism. And I want your thoughts. What do you think? What are some questions that come to mind? What are some things that are worrying you about this time? What do you still not understand about communism? Now, I'm not an expert, but I can try to help you. What are some things that you don't understand about how it may work or what it looks like? And so give me a question, give me a comment based on something that we talked about today.